Welcome to nutrient cycles or biogeochemical cycles if you want the fancy term. Now, before we get into this, I want to make sure we're clear about a couple points. The first is energy is going to move through a system in one direction. So when you start off, you've got the sun cranking in a whole bunch of energy, and so this energy starts to move along to the herbivores, and then eventually to those secondary consumers, the omnivores, the carnivores, and then the decomposers. But as energy moves, it's given off as heat, some of it's not broken down, so it's present in the waste, and so eventually this energy kind of trickles out, and really you end up with pretty much no energy left at the end. Now the energy hasn't been destroyed, it's just given off as heat, it's ultimately released to the universe, but it's not usable by organisms. So energy is going to be one directional and it's going to get smaller as it goes. Now with nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, these elements, these compounds, they cannot just, go off like heat can. And so when we talk about these, we're going to talk about cycles because they will continually shift around. So if I eat something, I get those elements that it possesses, or I excrete them and then they're back in the soil where they can go back into plants and they can get eaten again, but they are going to be completely cycled. We don't lose them like we do energy because there is no sense like heat for it to be lost too. There's no way for us to kind of have the nutrients become completely and forever inaccessible like we tend to have with heat in many cases, where in terms of life, it's no longer a big deal. Now for the names, we're going to call these biogeochemical cycles to try to emphasize that when we look at nutrients and how they move through an ecosystem, there will be a component where they move through life. That's the bio part. So, we have elements, we have compounds that are within us, we eat nutrients, and then there's typically a geological, there's a abiotic, there's might be rocks, it could be just long-term storage in fossil fuels or underground water, and so there's these longer-term geological formations that can store nutrients. Now these longer-term, these geological formations can also be released later and become biological. So there's this interfacing between life and the abiotic environment. So bio-geo, that's what this is referring to. And then the cycle, of course, because this is going to continually shift around, we're not going to lose any of these things. Now the three that I'm going to bring up briefly, and I'm not going to try to go in painful detail here, is the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Carbon, because obviously this is critical for all organic material, which is based on carbon, and life's based on that. Water, we've talked about, is critical to life, so we're going to focus on that a bit just because we're made up of mostly water. And nitrogen is one of the most important nutrients, especially for plants and autotrophs, so we'll bring that up just because of that. So the water cycle, as I said, trying to be clear here, you're going to have where there's water vapor in the air. It will condense, which means go from a gas to a liquid. You can also, so condensation here, and then that is going to fall down as precipitation. That could be sleet, rain, snow, whatever. As that goes, some of that's going to end up on the surface water, so this will be oceans, lakes, rivers. Some of it is going to be absorbed into the ground, and so you'll have this groundwater, which is going to be water that is below us. This is what you do when you drill a well. You're trying to get to that groundwater that's kind of seeped through the soil, and so now it's filled up these gaps below us in the rocks, and so you've got like underground lakes, if you will. That's groundwater. And then, of course, we've got these reservoirs, big reservoirs like the ocean we've already talked about. Now, the surface water especially, and plants will be a part of this, will have where they have evaporation occur. If plants do this, it's like sweating for plants, we call it transpiration. So evaporation and transpiration is going to make liquid water that's kind of on the surface go back up into the atmosphere as water vapor, as a gas, where it can condense again and the cycle continues. And so this is kind of the general pathway that water is going to take. It's never gone for good, it's just a matter of where it is currently. Is it on the surface? Is it as a gas? Is it underground until eventually that comes out either as a spring or because we've tapped it like a well? Now the next cycle we've got is the carbon cycle. Now this one I like to make sure I bring up because we talk a lot earlier in the year about CO2, which has a critical role in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses it, and it's released by cell respiration. So you'll see here, photosynthesis is going to use the CO2, it's going to store it, that's why it's the green, whereas cellular respiration is going to release it. And so these two together tend to pretty much cancel each other out. So animals as a whole only do cell respiration, so we are going to release CO2 and use oxygen. Plants are going to do mostly photosynthesis, so as a whole, they're going to use CO2 and release oxygen. And when you kind of put the two together, you tend to get about equal amounts. That tends to pretty much balance out. You'll also see that CO2 can diffuse into water pretty readily. I mean, you've got like carbonated drinks that have CO2 in them. In that case, they overpressurize it. That's why it bubbles out. But in general, CO2 can be stored. It can diffuse into water at a pretty decent amount. But it can also diffuse out of water, a lot of it depending on temperature. So once again, this will pretty much balance out. So you're going to have where CO2 can go into water, get stored, it can come out of water, be released, pretty much balances. Now the trick here is you also get, whereas things die, their carbon can be stored longer term in rock. And you'll see calcium carbonate is commonly referred to as limestones, the common one you'll see, and fossil fuels. Now these are long-term storages that don't get released as often. So these ones are typically out of the equation for quite a long time. With weathering and such, they can be exposed, they can kind of come back into things, but generally speaking, they're out for a long time and they're gradually released back in. Now humans are making this a bit interesting because we are now using a bunch of these fossil fuels, and so we are burning them, which is releasing CO2. And so when we talk about the rising CO2 levels, that's where most of it is coming from, is we have kind of imbalanced things because we're taking this long-term storage, we're burning it, which produces CO2 and releases it, and that overwhelms the photosynthesis side. The photosynthesis side can't store the CO2 fast enough. And so we end up having increasing amounts of CO2 over time, which is what we have. Because while these things tend to balance out, CO2 is being used a fair amount by this, so it's lowering the amount. Respiration and such is going to be increasing the amount, but these things are pretty much balancing out. That's our big problem right now with the carbon cycle, is that we're just releasing too much of this long-term stored carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and now we've got this imbalance that's making our amount go up and can lead to things potentially like global warming. Now nitrogen is going to be one of the most intriguing because we've got a ton of it. If you look at nitrogen, that's almost 80% of our atmosphere. So if you think there's lots of oxygen, plenty, we breathe, we're happy, there's way more nitrogen. But the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is inaccessible. We cannot use it. There's only certain bacteria that are in the soil. We call these guys nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And these are the only guys that we have that can take that atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into compounds like ammonia. We then have other bacteria that can take ammonia and they can convert it to other useful compounds like nitrates. And nitrates can be used by plants. Some ammonia can, but primarily nitrates can be used by plants as fertilizer. So this is why a lot of fertilizer will say nitrates on it, because that's where it's getting the nitrogen that it needs to grow. And so at that point, the plants will grow with that nitrogen. Animals will get nitrogen by eating the plants. Animal waste as well as their dead bodies get broken down by decomposers, which releases nitrogen back in the soil. There are also some bacteria, though, that will actually convert these nitrates and this ammonia back into nitrogen gas. So you'll see there is kind of a loop here where there are some things that convert these nitrogen compounds that are usable, that organisms can use, into nitrogen gas, which is not typically usable. But then once again, that's balanced out by the bacteria that are fixing the nitrogen to make it usable again. So we do need to have these nitrogen fixing guys. They're critical. This is one of the reasons why people like growing peanuts and beans so much, because those types of plants tend to have a lot of these bacteria that actually grow in the roots, in these little bumps called nodules. And that's why you don't have to use as much fertilizer, because they have these bacteria that live symbiotically with them that pretty much provide them with fertilizer. Whereas when you grow crops that don't have that relationship, they use all this nitrogen. We then take it and eat the nitrogen, so it's gone. It's no longer part of the soil. And so people have to keep fertilizing year after year because they've depleted those nutrients from the soil. Now, if we just let the plants die and kept all the nutrients there, if we didn't take the stuff away so we could eat it elsewhere, this wouldn't be as much of a problem. But with modern day agriculture, we tend to grow things, take the corn, package it, ship it to another city, so all of those nutrients that are packaged in our food don't go back to the soil where we're trying to grow our food. So the solution there is either grow plants that kind of fertilize themselves because they have this relationship with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, or The other solution is we go ahead and in a lab, we make a whole bunch of these nitrates and we go spray them on the field so there's plenty of nutrients there when we need it.